Hi folks. This session will address European urbanization during a very important transitional period, 1500 to 1750. This goes by lots of names, but we're going to call it early modern. Your text does not really cover this period in any detail, so this integrity class is pretty important. The image on slide 1 is Christopher Wren's plan for the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire in 1666. We will talk about it a little bit more later in this session. What I want to introduce to you are the major changes that were taking place in Europe during this period, paying greatest attention to the forces that most affected cities. In particular, I want you to understand that this is a broadly transitional period and that many of the forces we talk about now will have even greater impact in the next historical period. There are 4 major forces that we will mention. Slide 2. First, Western Europe, especially the Northwest, was swept by the 3 R's. No, not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but Renaissance, Reformation, and Revolution. Given that this is not a European history course, I will glide over these concepts, but I do expect that you know something about them, so head off to Wikipedia if necessary. The Renaissance moved from Italy, centered in Florence, northward and westward. Overall, it can be broadly summarized as the rediscovery of Greco-Roman culture and the classical arts. The Reformation was the Protestant Reformation, which challenged the by then hegemonic hold that Roman Catholicism had over most of Europe. The Revolution was twofold. Mostly, I am referring to the scientific revolution and the impact that it had on knowledge and practice throughout society. I am also referring partially to political revolution, as the traditional powers that were based on hereditary rulers was being challenged in the form of democracy movements, sometimes violently. We'll see how these forces play out. Second, mercantilism arose during this period. You probably were taught about mercantilism in middle school and high school American history courses, and think about it from the perspective of the American colonies. You need to expand your understanding, because mercantilism is a much broader concept that has a tremendous impact on urbanization in Europe during this period. It can be defined as a system of national-level economic enhancements through commerce and trade. A simpler way to think about it is simply economic nationalism. The key to understanding mercantilism is that it was an economic political philosophy and a set of practices put into place by European nation-states during this early modern period. The major components of this policy were A, to protect the national-level economy from external threats. To do this, they imposed external tariffs at the national scale on goods and services produced in other competing nation-states. B, they wanted to enhance the national economy by reducing competition within the boundaries of the nation-state, typically by abolishing internal tariffs that one city, formerly a city-state, might impose against another city within the same nation-state. C, to create extensive and stable internal markets, thus ensuring demand for goods. And D, to enhance production by encouraging the increase in the scale of production and allowing for economies of scale, which is a concept that we will come back to when we talk about industrialization. Slide 3 shows the boundaries of European nation-states about midway through our period in 1648. What this map shows you is that with the exception of the middle swath of the continent, north to south, nation-states, typically kingdoms, were mostly in place. The glaring exceptions were in the old Holy Roman Empire, currently Germany, and Italy. These areas did not coalesce into true nation-states until the mid-19th century. Slide 4. In order to accomplish strong and stable internal demand for goods and to provide an ample source of raw materials, nation-states began to compete against one another on the global stage through exploration and colonization. Slide 4 shows a global map with the holdings of the European nation-states shaded in different colors. The point in these activities, i.e. exploration and colonization, was nationalistic. But more pointedly for us, it was to ensure that there was a stable market for goods produced in the mother country and a sufficient supply of raw materials for processing from the colonies. This is why you saw laws that might seem strange to us from a colonial perspective, that colonial residents had to purchase their processed and manufactured goods as imports from the mother country, even when they could be produced more cheaply in the colony. So in India, for example, which became one of Great Britain's major cotton-producing colonies, colonists and colonial subjects had to buy textiles produced in England. As you know from American history, another role from the colonies was in fact to provide the raw materials, as we have already mentioned. Slide 5. Mercantilism came to support expanded production at home in the mother country. This came very quickly to entail dramatic changes in the production system that would, in fairly short order, create a dramatic production revolution, i.e. the Industrial Revolution, which is coming at the end of the period that we are currently talking about. We're not there yet, but it's coming. In this period, the early modern period, the key was to encourage changes to the production system that would emphasize quantity over quality. You will recall that urban-based guild system of artisanal craft production was founded on the bedrock of the guild's power to regulate and control entry into the production system. The goal of the guilds was to compete on quality, because a city-state's reputation in terms of the quality goods that it produced was essential to its success in global competition. Any reduction in the perceived quality of goods produced would damage the city-state's reputation and weaken its competitive position. As the well-being of the individual city-states was being challenged by the increasing mercantile power of the nation-states, the guild system had to be weakened. The result was a set of innovations, typically outside of cities in the way that things were made. This new system, which we'll call for the moment proto-industrialism, emphasized the rapid production of ever larger quantities of items, even at the sacrifice of the quality of the items. The point was to move towards the mass production of goods sustained by the presence of a mass market. And for the market, remember the colonists. The key innovation in proto-industrialism was a deep division of the production process, what scholars call the division of labor. In the guild-regulated craft production system, an item was fabricated or processed from start to finish by a single craftsman with help from the journeymen and apprentices. Think of a pair of shoes. As a customer, you would go to the point of production, the workshop, where your measurements would be taken. At that point, production of the final shoes starts with raw materials, leather. The cutting, shaping, sewing, and every other step in the process took place right there in the workshop, with the same individual guiding the process throughout. In proto-industrialism, the labor process is divided into discrete steps, each of which is conducted by different people. No one person needs the knowledge or skill to conduct fabrication from start to finish, only the skill necessary to complete the one task. The images on slide 5 show the new technologies associated with textile production, which was one of the first areas to experiment with proto-industrial production methods. On the left is the carding device, which would line up raw fibers in the same direction and complete the process of cleaning out the raw material. On the right is a spinning device, which would put together the raw, oriented fibers into long strands of yarn, which, if spun carefully and long enough, could be reasonably thin. Slide 6. The image on slide 6 shows an early mechanical loom upon which weaving would take place. The importance of these images is not just to show you what the stuff looked like, but more importantly to illustrate that the process of producing textiles was divided into distinct steps, each of which could be done by different people. In the villages where this was practiced, the raw wool would be taken in at the first house in a circuit of houses. There, the wool would be cleaned by hand and put out the following night for pickup. The members of the household, often the women and the children, would be paid by the pound for clean wool. After picking up the cleaned wool, the producer would take it to the next house on the circuit, where it would be carded. The carded wool would then be taken to a third house for spinning, and then after spinning to a fourth house for weaving into fabrics. At the end of this deeply divided labor process, the producer would have textiles. This whole process is called putting out. The benefit of putting out is that the individual households, incentivized by the piecework pay, figured out ways to do their specialized tasks really quickly. This divided labor process served as the forerunner of industrial factories. Slide 7. It's an outline. Let's look at changes in the urban system during this period. First, the center of economic power shifted from the Mediterranean city-states to the North Atlantic, i.e., the Hanseatic towns came to outcompete the Italian city-states. This was in part because the Hanseatic towns were smaller and emphasized more basic commodities. As the logic of mercantilism emerged and grew stronger, it augmented the strong nationalist forces which were already stronger in the north than in the south of Europe. Note the fragmentation of Italy. Also, the smaller, more basic production techniques practiced in the north eventually were more amenable to the new production processes that emphasized quantity over quality. Also, there were a series of princely cities outside of the trade systems that continued to exist as sites of absolute monarchy. Slide 8 shows a stylized period painting of a city representative of some of these trends of early modern European cities. Zamość, Poland. It clearly maintained a defensive nature with a well-developed set of walls and raised fortifications. It was also quite orderly, as we will see in the next slide. Slide 9 shows 3 contemporary photos of Zamość. In the upper left, an aerial shot shows the one remaining star-like fortification and the ordered town behind. The upper right shows the prominent town hall on the central square. The panorama at the bottom of the slide is of the square, and you can see the tidy buildings all facing into the public space. Slide 10. Let's look at changes in the internal spatial structure of cities during this period. 1. As long-distance trade, commercial capitalism, continues to be the economic engine driving urbanization, we see cities emphasize the infrastructure needed for such economic activity. Thus, we see an increase in the size and dominance of trading facilities within the urban landscape. 2, we also see increased size and dominance for transportation infrastructure related to both exporting goods made within the city and importing goods made other places. 3, we see the emergence of and an increased role for land and real estate markets within cities. Since cities were not organized according to aristocratic or feudal principles, the legal and institutional infrastructure for buying and selling land had to be developed. 4, we see a greatly increased degree of spatial segregation within the cities. The landed elites, the rural landed elites or noblemen, would often build town houses on the edges of cities in order to have a presence in the increasingly important cities. Similarly, newly rich merchant class leaders built large new urban estates, often within cities, sometimes in the same areas that the rural noblemen had their houses. These were some of the first exclusively residential areas within cities, and they deepened class-based segregation. In addition, the functional separation of different land use deepened within cities of this era. This is shown in slide 11, which is a map of the land use of London in the mid-17th century. London, as other large and increasingly complex cities, increasingly had deeply segmented land use patterns. You may be able to see in this image, if you zoom in or if you can look carefully, that the different colors represent different kinds of land use, and that specific manufacturing activities are indicated to you either by name or by letter on this map. And you can see that there is a pretty clear demarcation of the different kinds of land use in the different areas of London. In addition, most cities during this period began to develop districts whose primary purpose was to sell commodities. That is, these were the first urban shopping districts. Instead of buying only from artisanal producers at the site of production, folks increasingly began to specialized districts, shopping districts, where stores were maintained and consumers could buy a variety of goods. Slides 12 through 15 will show the Great Fire of London in 1666. Starting with slide 12, we see a before map of London as it was in 1611. You can see the organic layout of the streets and alleyways, along with the London Bridge across the Thames River, which is of children's song fame. Slide 13 is an artist's depiction of the fire itself, which consumed much of the built-up portion of the city. Note in the foreground the Tower of London, which is a prominent and long-lasting landmark. And in the background you see St. Peter's Cathedral, prominent with flames just behind it. London Bridge is just before that and to the left. Slide 14 is a modern cartographic representation of the burned area, depicted in pink. The Roman walls are shown as well in black, indicating that most of the old section of the city was consumed. Slide 15 is once again Christopher Wren's design for a new London. Wren's plan was a vision of great, straight boulevards and piazzas, wiping out the medieval tangle of alleys and laneways, anticipating the great urban boulevards of the 18th and 19th centuries. It was never adopted, though, mainly because home and business owners began to rebuild on the foundations of their old premises before any new streets could be laid out. The lighter shaded areas on this image show the extent of London's Great Fire.